Hello and welcome to this video. My name's Imogen Edmonds and I'm Managing Director of Redwing Solutions, a HR consultancy specialising in HR for early years. So we work with day nurseries, preschools and out-of-school clubs across the UK. You've got access to this video because you've bought the Redundancy Package from Redwing Solutions in May 2020. So in this package, it includes this video amongst other bits and pieces. And I wanted you to have this video so that you've got a useful reminder of what it is we will have discussed when we've had our one-to-one conversation. The objectives of this video are as follows. By the end of the video, you will have an understanding of what we mean by redundancy. You'll appreciate the steps involved in a redundancy and understand how we will adapt normal processes to comply with the requirements of employment law, even though, for many of us, we are still in a lockdown situation. Now, redundancy is one of 5 potentially fair reasons for a dismissal. And I say potentially fair because obviously just because you've called it a capability dismissal doesn't mean to say it'll ultimately be a fair dismissal. The 5 reasons are as follows: misconduct, i.e. being naughty at work; capability, which may well be something to do with a problem with your performance and your ability to do the job you're employed to do; a statutory reason, commonly something like not able to continue to employ this person, perhaps because they don't have the paperwork to mean that they can work in the UK; redundancy, which is the one we're talking about today; and number 5 is some other substantial reason. So redundancy is one of the 5 potentially fair reasons for a dismissal, and in the current pandemic, more and more people, I'm afraid, will face redundancy as the end of their employment with their employer. Now, redundancy has a very tight definition in terms of why it exists, why it happens. It shouldn't be about the person, it should be about the post, though when it happens to you, and it has happened to me, it feels very personal. So a redundant role will happen because the role no longer exists. This has happened over time because technology has replaced the need for people's roles to exist. Perhaps an organisation has stopped doing something they previously did and that role was there just for that purpose. And in a nursery environment, it may well be that you restructure. You decide that you can no longer afford to employ certain roles to do certain roles to certain jobs if other people could do that as part of their job, and the role will no longer exist following a redundancy. The place of work is closing, and again, not at all uncommon. People will have a contract to employment which will say where they work, and maybe somewhere will decide to relocate somewhere else and close the one place of work and invite the employees to apply to take their jobs with them elsewhere. But they may not choose to do that, and that may be why their roles are redundant. Or it may be that the place of work is a business and the business is closing. And again, people might find in this pandemic that they decide to shrink the number of settings that they operate from, decide to operate from a fewer number of settings, perhaps they're close together, and you can consolidate. A business closing, again, will happen. Some businesses will determine that this 2020 academic year will be their last, and they will determine to finish that academic year in July and not reopen again in September. Others won't be even necessarily sure that they'll make it that far. There may be a reduced need for the work to be undertaken. So in a nursery environment, you could have a situation where you lose 25% of your private fee-paying customers, which isn't unlikely given the pandemic. A quarter of your private parents deciding not to use your services in the future. If that situation is then mirrored by your workforce, you may decide to cut your workforce by a similar 25%, by a similar quarter. And that would mean that you might need a reduced number of, say, early years practitioners that you employ. You might reduce those by 25% to match the loss that you would have. Maybe you no longer want to work with somebody, and that isn't a redundancy. And I'm afraid this video won't help you if you are looking to, if you like, get your own back at people who haven't supported you. This is about fair processes, and ultimately some people will be asked to leave your organisation, and it should be for all the right reasons. Let's go through some redundancy myths. One of the most common myths I hear people ask me, or tell me, shall we say, when it comes to redundancy, is the myth that somebody, once they've been made redundant, can't ever be re-employed by that employer. And it is a myth, because circumstances can change, and they can actually change quite quickly. Everyone who's listening to this video is probably considered to be a small business. And in small businesses, situations can pivot very, very quickly indeed. The smaller the business, often the quicker it can pivot. So you can end up with a situation where on a Friday at 5 o'clock, a role is redundant. The sales are not looking good. The requirement for that role isn't looking great at all. And then by Monday morning, you've had an order placed, which can change that situation entirely. And in many situations, we'll actually withdraw notice of redundancy because after notice has been given, something will have changed that will result in us actually no longer needing to make that role redundant. That makes for an interesting conversation, I can tell you. Once a role is redundant, you won't be able to rehire for a period of 12 months. And this myth exists because people believe that if that role has been made redundant, then there's going to have to be a very long passage of time before the employer will be entitled to re-employ people to do that role. And that again isn't the situation. Like I said in one, your circumstances can change. You could find that you get parents that do enrol with your nursery. You can find that people change their mind about perhaps educating their children from home and decide to make use of the nursery environment. Some people might decide to pull their children out in order to homeschool them and to not have a lifestyle that requires them to go to school, go to nursery, go to work. And their employers may well have tolerated them working from home with their children during the pandemic. But as we return to some degree of normality, the employer's insistence might well be, no, actually you will work 9 to 5. And that means that you can't obviously be caring for children at the same time. So they might come back to what they've used to before, back to the childcare they've previously enjoyed. And so therefore you will be able to rehire. The circumstances will change. Another local nursery may close, which may well result in an influx of children into your nursery. And that situation can mean that you need to rehire people. And if there's been a passage of time, there'll be no obligation for you to go back to those people that previously occupied those roles, but you could if you wanted to. If you close a place of work and you have work elsewhere, the affected staff have to take those roles. Well, many settings have got several limited companies, which is often recommended. So if you've got ABC Limited, GEF Limited underneath your umbrella, then you may well be able to move people within what we call the group, but you won't have to. You may be able to. And any way you can avoid a redundancy by moving people within your businesses is going to be advantageous. But the employer would want continuity of service for that to happen. So the process itself. There will be a situation where the need for redundancy can occur overnight. So decisions can be taken by other people. Perhaps you operate out of a village hall and the trustees are advised that you're no longer going to be operating out of that village hall and they've served you with notice. And you won't be able to reopen perhaps after this pandemic. This situation can be incredibly upsetting for everybody because whilst you've got to get your head around the fact that you've lost your business, you've then got to act quickly to inform your staff and to communicate with your staff and consult with them over the redundancy that's likely to occur. Ideally, a business will know that redundancy is necessary, and I will always encourage everyone to consider what might be, because the more prepared you are, the more professional you will be when you have to make these decisions. Nobody wants to do redundancy in a blind panic. So if you think that redundancy may occur, you've got the advantage over people who perhaps don't think that this may occur until it happens to them, because a redundancy literally can creep up on you. Our redundancies are there because the role is no longer required or is a diminished need for that role. So it's not necessarily something you've done, but it's something that's happened that you can't control. And it won't be down to the individual. It won't be down to their personality or their performance necessarily. It may well just be that that role cannot continue, and there's nothing they could have done personally to affect that. Once you've pressed that redundancy button, that button is pressed. And what I mean by that is everything up until the day you press the redundancy button is in your control. Once you've pressed that button, you have to do certain things in certain orders. Certain steps have to be taken. Things can't be missed. You can't decide, oh, I don't feel like doing that today. Oh, I think I'll put that off to tomorrow. There's a timetable. There's expectations. There's staff out there expecting you to follow the process. So once you press it, there's no going back. Unless, as I said earlier, you're in that lucky position that once you get to issuing notices of redundancies, you're able to actually withdraw those notices because circumstances have changed. And I really wish that for many of you. So let's talk about the steps involved in a redundancy. For the first of all, we need to identify the reason that a redundancy may occur. And we write then what we call, throughout the whole process, as the paragraph. Now, without doubt, the paragraphs that you and I will be writing together in this journey will involve the phrase coronavirus pandemic. And it's with very good reason. Your employees need to know that their redundancy is as a result of the pandemic that we're all experiencing. Once you've identified your paragraph, then we will identify who will be affected. And what we mean by this is, where will these redundancies likely to occur? If it's a larger organisation, then we may well be consulting with people about redundancies that may occur in their location, but not necessarily their department. And we'll be consulting with people because they have a right to know that redundancies are occurring in their location. With larger scale redundancies, there's also implications with regard to consultation, and we'll talk about that further in this video. But if you identify who will be affected, you might well be identifying pools of people for where you need redundancies to occur. You might be identifying, say, the early years practitioners at a particular location, and as I said previously, thinking that perhaps 25% of their roles are at risk. Well, if you've got 4 roles, then that's 1 post, and therefore you would consult with all 4 people in that role with the view to selecting 1 post to be lost through redundancy. Once you've identified who you'll be consulting with, you can obviously make sure that you're in a position to communicate with those people. So one of the things I'll be asking you to do is to make sure that you've got access to their names and addresses and personal email addresses. And I will want you to make sure that those are proper personal email addresses. There is nothing worse than sending an email to somebody whose email address is the Smiths family @ and then finding that actually their younger son opened the email before the mother did to read that her role was at risk of redundancy. And it's more common than you think that people will share a family email address. So I don't want you to send an email unless you can be sure that the person who's going to receive it and open it is the person for whom the email is intended. So getting together their names and addresses in a means that make it easy for you to communicate will be important. And if you've got any IT skills, I'd recommend a spreadsheet so that you can do a mail merge. It just makes the whole thing much more professional. You'll identify what form your redundancy will take. And at this stage, you'll be looking to see whether, following the redundancy, so following a restructure, you need to remove certain roles that you have a reduced need for or you no longer need. Maybe that role will be standalone, so you might decide that you no longer need, say, let's think of a role, a chef. Maybe you've decided that in the future, children will bring sandwiches and that will be it. So you've decided to place the role of chef at risk of redundancy. There won't be anybody else to consult with over that role being at high risk because there's only 1 chef employed. But if there had been a team, you would have obviously needed to consult with the whole team before identifying which of the chefs would be at risk of redundancy, or at high risk as we call it. So you'll identify what form your redundancy will take. Will it be certain roles being lost? Or as we said previously, will it be a reduction in the need for work to be undertaken? That will then lead us to have our pools. So say you have a health and safety manager, which you've decided is a role that you no longer need in your organisation, and that responsibility can be spread amongst others. That would be a pool of one, and there'd be 1 post holder in that pool. You could have a pool of many, so say 5 quality engineers, 5 nursery nurses. They would be a pool of many, and therefore you would return to consult with all 5 before identifying which of those would be at risk of redundancy. It's really essential that you identify whether you're removing a post or reducing the number of people employed, because if it's the latter, we need certain additional things that we don't need with the former. The main thing we need is a selection criteria, and this will be drawn up by you and I to ensure that it is what we agree to be largely objective. What we don't want in any redundancy is the suggestion that all of our data is subjective and no evidence can be found to support the decisions you've made. So saying, well, that person's supervisions came up very badly, maybe their performance is a bit ropey, maybe they're not very flexible, they don't really do the hours that you want them to do when you ask them to do extra. Those things would all be very subjective. What we're always aiming for in a redundancy is that my mum, who knows nothing about your business, could look at the evidence that you've collated and come to the same conclusions you have. So that's what we call my mum test. So service will obviously be one of the factors that we will most likely to have in your selection criteria. And often when I use the word service, employers are confused, and they ask me again, say it again, what do you mean? Service is the time between someone's start date and today. So someone may have 10 years service with yourself, and you may wish to determine that those people with longer serving are more likely to survive a redundancy than those who are shorter serving, for whom you haven't yet got to know. Maybe some people will be under 2 years service with yourself. So service will be one of the factors. Another factor that we'll often use is attendance. And so long as we aren't using, say, the dates that somebody was on maternity leave as their attendance, or the dates they were off for pregnancy-related absenteeism, then there can be many occasions where someone's absence over the last 12 months will factor into the score that they receive in the selection criteria. And the reason why we have the words X and Y is because I want us to pick a date frame for us to refer to, and then we'll be consistent throughout the whole redundancy. So say we've decided that this pandemic didn't really start impacting us until February. Maybe your choose is to look at all of the absenteeism between 1st of February 2019 and the 31st of January 2020. And that will be your time frame that we will use for both attendance and probably for training courses completed. Timekeeping could be exactly the same. Timekeeping is less common in day nurseries than in some other environments because many of you do not have the means of actually recording whether someone has given you good timekeeping or not. But if you do have a clocking machine or one of these fingerprint testing entry systems, that means that you can download the data, name of which escapes me for the moment. If you have that, then obviously that data can be used. And as I say, we do have hourly paid employees working in the sector whose hours are calculated off timesheets. So that could be fair. Experience, and now this again can be experience within your business or within the sector. You may decide to separate it and have two different elements. So maybe somebody has experience of working in more than one area of your nursery, and that is something you wish to hold on to. Maybe they are specialists with babies, but they've got experience with toddlers. Maybe they have experience from outside of their working time with you and evidence that you would find on their CV. Maybe they have qualifications that you wish to hold on to. So maybe you might prioritise somebody who's got the NVQ level 3 over somebody that hasn't yet achieved that level of qualification because of the degree of usefulness it is to you and your business. Maybe they've undertaken quite a lot of training and you wish to again hold on to those people because of their use to your business. Maybe they have skills and certain qualifications, certain abilities that again you want to hold on to. But this would need to be supported by a skills matrix that again hadn't been drawn up in light of a redundancy but existed prior. One thing I hear a lot of people saying is, can we still use LIFO? LIFO stands for last in, first out. And since we've had age discrimination legislation back in 2009, we do need to worry that those allegations will be levelled if you start using LIFO, that someone with shorter service is likely to be a younger employee and someone with longer service is likely to be an older employee. So potential for age discrimination is there. Please be very careful if thinking of using LIFO and take advice from ourselves as to whether this can constitute a problem for your nursery and your business. We really must be non-discriminatory. So again, if we're looking to move people on and use redundancy in order to do that, then that always worries me that the allegation will be levelled at you that your actions have been about the person and not the post. We must hold our desire to make sure that our decisions are able to be supported through evidence and subjective evidence at that. And we should be non-subjective evidence at that. And we should be able to prove that we haven't been discriminatory in the decisions we've taken when we've applied the selection criteria. The selection criteria scoring will be checked for sense, will be in draft before it is approved, and will be carried out by two assessors. So two people will score the selection criteria and sign the form. What will then give us is obviously an overview of the people in that pool and the scores that they've been given. We'll decide at the outset whether for you the logic is that a high scoring person is at high risk or a low scoring person is at high risk, and everyone sees that differently. Don't worry, we'll work that out together. And when we make sure that the individuals are consulted with, we will be sharing with them their results, and we will anonymise the results of others so that they can see where they sit. This is important for people to accept the decision you've taken for their role to be at high risk of redundancy, an important part of the process. And don't worry, it isn't uncommon for people to only have one point between being at risk and not at risk. I'm afraid that's the reality for many. Let's talk about the fact that your redundancy may well take you into an area where consultation won't be down for you to decide, but actually will be determined by regulations. Where an employer is looking to make 20 or more redundancies, they must start consultation 30 days before any dismissals take effect. And this means that for many environments, the end of May, if you're going to make redundancies at the end of June when furlough ends, will be coming up very soon. If it's 100 or more redundancies, it's 45 days. So around about the 16th of May, if we're going to use the end of June, furlough arrangements coming to an end as a deadline. So as you can imagine, there's a lot to do before that. Collective consultation requires employee representatives to be identified. You won't be individually consulting with your staff when there's more than 20. You will have to identify reps to act as that role between you and the employee. Employee reps can either be a trade union rep, and that's fine if you're identified as being represented by a trade union, but I have to say I can't think of a nursery in the UK that I've met that is. Or elected reps. These are people that you actually identify, you hold an election for as a result of needing to consider redundancies. And again, that would need to be handled and taken care of in the next month / 16 days, or even less. The date of recording this is the 3rd of May, so 13 days if it was more than 100. Collective consultations will always cover ways in which they'll be trying to avoid a redundancy, making sure that all the representatives are very clear on the reasons for the redundancy, so what we've previously called the paragraph, and thinking about ways in which we'll try and keep redundancies to a minimum and how we can limit the effects for employees involved. So outplacement, retraining, offers of support and what have you. Maybe trying to find them other jobs in other nurseries. Very many businesses will be quite creative and will do whatever they can to help people to secure work elsewhere. And it's to their credit. Let's think about consultation. Every employer, regardless of the number of people that they're going to make redundant, need to consult. And it's an incredibly important stage. The rules state that consultation must be meaningful and genuine. And what does that mean? Well, it doesn't mean that you will necessarily do it in a rushed fashion. It doesn't mean that you will have a foregone conclusion that that role will be lost. You will be trying everything in your power to avoid a redundancy. So maybe you don't need somebody to be full-time, but you do have a part-time position that you could offer them. That would be raised at consultation, and you'd be doing everything you could to convince that employee to perhaps secure their staying with your organisation by taking the vacancy on offer. Consultation must take place with that aim, and that aim must be held and believed by the person handling the consultation process. It'll typically take weeks, not months, and that's where you've got less than 20 or less than 100 people involved. Clearly, when it's outside of those numbers, it will take months. And how long will depend on the circumstances. I often talk about a 10-day process from the moment we have the first meeting to the moment we handle notice. Let's think of some terms that you've got to remember throughout the whole redundancy process, and we'll be using them a lot together. We'll use the word potential that that role is at risk of redundancy. Possible redundancies in the location you work. The proposed redundancy in your department. These all say, this is not a done deal, this has not already been decided. I and everyone here will do everything within our power to avoid this role being made redundant. One of the big things that happens between an employer and an employee during a redundancy programme are the communication. And in this very strange times where having meetings is not as possible as it was previously, a lot of our best communication will be done by letter. So we will provide a letter for you to communicate between yourselves and your employees that there is a risk of redundancy. There'll be other letters, what we call consultation letters, that will be forwarded to you to use in this process. It's really important that letters are cleverly and carefully crafted. What we don't want to do is to send the wrong person the wrong letter. What we don't want to do is to write to somebody and not spell their name correctly. What we don't want to do is to suggest that they have a job title that they've never seen before. So it's really important to get this right. and always write in a tone that is supportive. Whilst required by law, we can still communicate humanely and kindly and friendly. I will often use the phrase, "I apologise for the formal tone of this letter" towards the end of our letters, and this is really to say to that employee, we recognise this is quite a formal letter because it has to contain certain formal clauses and paragraphs, but an apology from the writer is basically acknowledging that this is what they've read and that the reasons why it was needed you would assume would be known to the individual. I think that also creates the right impression. People do want this process to be handled correctly. Maya Angelou said that it wasn't what people said to you that you remember, it's how they made you feel. And I think this is very true with how employers handle their employees during the coronavirus pandemic. When we get to the process of not being able to avoid a redundancy and an employee has to be given notice, remember that is the notice from you as their employer to them. And in your contracts of employment, you will often find that there are two forms of notice determined. There'll be the notice that the employee has to give you, if they should wish to leave, and the notice that you have to give them. Whether someone works their notice will largely depend on what's in the contract of employment. Not all contracts of employment talk about garden leave, not all contracts of employment talk about payment in lieu of notice, otherwise known as pile-on. It is possible that your employees may well serve their notice whilst furloughed, and that is something that clearly will present you with other challenges. But it is possible. If the employee is working, then obviously the person may not wish or be able to serve their notice, and you would need to consider the impact of making them work their notice on them and your business. If the individual isn't required to work their notice to serve their notice, then obviously that may well be desirable for them and for you. Holiday can often be taken during notice period if specified in the contract. Alternatively, the employer can always serve notice to the employee as to the amount of holiday they wish somebody to take and when. And this is a separate matter to redundancy. What will happen afterwards? We're getting to the end of our video now, and after an employee has been given notice of redundancy and advised that their position has been lost, the employee has got the right to time off for job search. So if they're in work, they can have what's called 2/5 of the week. So if they work 5 days, that's approximately 2 days during the entire notice period for time off for job search. The employers can, and often do, support their employees with what we call outplacement, and this can include CV writing, interview skills, things and techniques to help them effectively mount a job search. You may well find that you have a network of other employers in your area hiring people, and you can put your employees that you've placed notice of redundancy to about this in vacancies and explain to them that how they could apply. Maybe you've set introductions up. Many employees will look to you to provide them with a "to whom it may concern" reference. Now, we all know in safer recruitment these really aren't worth the paper they're written on, and many employers will still approach you in the future, and should do, for a reference for that employee. But it does make the redundant employee feel better, and therefore, again, it's kind to do this, even if you know that it won't very much hold them much use going forward without the ability for them to be able to reach out to someone else that they worked with. So if you are going to close the business, do think about how those people are going to be able to contact you as an individual for a reference in the future. And to not provide that would be considered to be petty at this time of national crisis. By doing what you can to support your employees both while they're employed by you and afterwards, you will be seen as an employer who has done their best in very difficult circumstances and has been the sort of employer that they can happily recommend to other people. And it will also help you because handling a redundancy process is a very difficult process. And throughout all of this, I will be encouraging you to take time to make sure you're okay. Because if you're not okay, you won't be able to do a good job at this redundancy. And it can well be a good job done. If you treat people decently and respectfully and communicate effectively, they can be left feeling that actually, whilst it wasn't very nice, it could have been handled a lot worse. And we do appreciate when people do go the extra mile to handle us with dignity and decency, even though circumstances are very difficult. So I will be checking in on you to make sure you're okay, and I suggest you check in on yourself as well. That's now the end of this video, and hopefully you'll be able to replay this to remind you of what it is we're doing and the stages that are involved. Again, we're here to help you and we'll hold your hand throughout.